From Wakefield, it's the Nolan Car Night Show, inviting you to join Nolan and his guest this week, Steve Stoliar, to the show. And now, ladies and gentlemen, here's Nolan.
And welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to yet another edition of the show. And let me tell you, I've been very fortunate enough to have a good string of great, amazing, legendary, one of a kind guests. And this person
Until
certainly,
now.
yeah, certainly fits the bill of that. This man was able to get not just a bird's eye view, but a direct 1-to-1 ratio view of one of the greatest comedians of all time and a member of one of the greatest comedic families of all time, as well as writing on such shows you may know, maybe the Dick Cavett Show. I know that's a small time show that some people may not know of, and Murder She Wrote as well, which is another one that you may know of. And on top of that, he wrote an amazing book, which is also an expanded edition of Raised Eyebrows, My Years Inside Groucho Marx's House, as well as a version of it that will be made into a movie in the near future as well. It's a pleasure to have Steve Stoliar on the show this week. Steve, how are you?
I'm fine. I could listen to you describe me for hours, but that wouldn't be very interesting for your listeners or viewers.
Well, you never know. Some people like that. It's always good to hear good things about oneself. I want to start like this, then we'll get on to the festivities as well.
Sure.
You, as I mentioned, you wrote, obviously the book, and then you wrote on TV shows and the movie that'll be coming out eventually that you had a major role in, seeing as it was about your life. In a sense, we're now able to see entertainment, specifically movies and other things of that nature, theater, which Groucho was a big proponent of, come back, be able to be publicly viewed as it once was before the last 3 years. So to see that from your perspective, what's it been like?
You mean to have films return to brick and mortar theater?
Yeah, well, to see, because I am with any project, it was put on hold through the last 3 years, and now things are able to be back in public, and you're able to go on to film sets and see things be filmed again as it used to be before the craziness happened.
Oh yeah. Well, yeah, COVID put the big chill over the country and much of the world. So it's good that we're able to get back to something like what it was before. Although I'm still not sure about the experience of going to a theater to see a film, which is as they're intended, because we've become so spoiled by having big screen TVs in the living room, and you can just stretch out and you don't have to tell the person in front of you to shut up, and you don't get black juji fruit stuck to the heels of your shoes, and it doesn't cost a fortune for a
Sure.
bucket of popcorn, but you miss the communal experience.
Yeah.
Plus, if you're seeing something with, extraordinary photography or special effects or something, it's diminished somewhat. But that trade-off of convenience is it's hard to argue against that.
Sure.
So I don't know if actual movie theaters are long for this world, or if it's going to become a private experience. But especially with comedies, I think, and horror movies, it's best to have them with a crowd so everyone can be scared or laugh.
Yeah.
Dramas or historical films or something like that, I guess you can watch on your own. But it's too bad if we're losing the communal experience of being in a dark theater where you can't stop, hit the pause, and go pee and
Yeah.
get something to eat and come back, or
Yeah.
phone call or something.
Yeah. That's the one downside that I featured when I saw the new Avatar movie, that you can't just pause it mid movie to say, "Oh, hey, here's something fun. I need to use the bathroom." Although at home, on another aspect, you don't have the luxury of stepping on popcorn in a dark theater and getting all in your shoes in front of a bunch of people in the middle seats. Of this all this time, the last few years has all given us, I feel as though, and correct me if I'm wrong, the opportunity to sort of reflect on ourselves and learn things about ourselves that we didn't know prior. So for you, Steve, what did you learn about yourself the last few years that you didn't know prior?
Oh, this is like take out a clean sheet of paper and put at the top how I spent my summer vacation. I
Yeah.
had a good time. I went to a camp. We played, we went fishing. It was fun. Actually, I made use of it. There was a project I had been meaning to do, but was concerned that it would be so time consuming and just such a dense project that I wasn't sure when I would have the time to really focus on it. and that was another book that I did uh, based on my father's wartime letters to my mother during World War II from Europe when he was fighting. I guess you have to say the original Nazis instead of
Yeah.
the cheap knockoffs we have now. And he, there were hundreds and hundreds of letters totaling thousands
Oh
of
wow.
pages, and I couldn't scan them because you can't edit, and many of them were handwritten. It really put my iMac through its paces because I had to sit down and input every letter
Oh wow.
before I could begin to decide what to keep, what to throw out, what to shorten. And so that I did make use of, basically being quarantined for that first year, and and put together a book called Salamis and Swastikas: Letters Home from a GI Jew, because he had such a hankering for kosher salami, and my mom would send it to him, and then the first few would rot on the ship from
Oh,
St. Louis to North Africa or Italy, and then finally they started arriving okay, and it was this theme all through these letters. Here he is dodging bombs and all this, and saying, boy, I could really go for, I don't want you to use up all your meat points that you're allowed, because I know you and the baby need to get food. But if you could find your way to find another salami, I know the boys and I. So I did create that other book, which now exists in 3 dimensions, and it's also filled with a lot of unpublished photos that my dad took or were taken of him
oh wow.
and his adventures with his dog and running into Bob Hope at a USO show. And anyway, so that's how I made use of the time.
Well, there you go.
Plus,
Cause sir, oh, go ahead.
oh well, plus there was still progress to be made on trying to nail down the elements of the film version of Raised Eyebrows. Um, COVID didn't end, uh, having the script sent to actors and seeking funding and revising the script and all sorts of things like that. So that was still an ongoing process despite COVID.
Well, that's always good to have that because, as I'm sure you're probably privy to, as a regular human watching the news and stuff, there are other ways that people decide to put their time together. I'm curious though, and this is sort of the first Groucho question I asked. Although he's been gone for a while now, of course, how do you think he would have handled and dealt with the pandemic?
Boy, well, he certainly would have abided by all the rules. Um, he wouldn't have thought it's not going to get me. I know what, you know. Uh, um, I'm sure it would have put a damper on his socializing, which is would have been too bad because he enjoyed having friends come over for lunch and find out what's new in entertainment and politics and whatever, stimulating conversation.
Yeah,
Uh, but he he was old enough to have lived through a number of earlier pandemics.
yeah,
There was a influenza uh, outbreak. We take it for granted now with vaccinations,
sure,
except for the fools who think vaccinations are bad. When many died from the flu because there weren't inoculations yet. Same thing with polio. And I think it was around 1912 there was a real sweeping flu pandemic, and Groucho would have been in his 20s already
yeah,
because he was born in 1890, which blew my mind because I was always a big history buff and I was always putting things in historical perspective. So, in addition to being in the presence of my hero and the star of Duck Soup and Night at the Opera and all that, I was getting to know someone who was born in 1890. I mean, it made him a literal Victorian, although he was American, not British. But
sure.
Victoria still had 11 years left
Oh
on the
wow.
throne in England. So he remembered the Wright brothers flight
Wow.
and the moon landing, which is such a huge span of
Sure.
time. I asked him once, how far back do you remember? And he said, I guess the Spanish American War, which was 1898,
Oh
with
wow.
Teddy Roosevelt going, with his Rough Riders. So he had a remarkable, you talk about my front row seat to Groucho. He had a front row seat to the history of pop culture and history itself
Sure.
from the late 1800s through the 1970s.
Yeah.
So yeah, he had survived the flu epidemic, and I guess he would have survived this as well.
Yeah, you never know. Those who I'm sure he would have found joy in it some way. I want to sort of start this with that sort of out of the way. Growing up Midwest, Missouri, how much of that had an influence in terms of your comedic intake compared to maybe when you were growing up when you were older in Los Angeles, if any at all?
Well, there was something very special about celebrities. That was sort of drilled into me by my parents. I mean, once we moved out to LA, if we saw any kind of bit part or character actor, my mom would say, Is that someone?
Yeah.
Is that someone? Oh, isn't that someone? So when I was a kid in St. Louis, I was only there till I was just about 8, but I still have vivid memories of St. Louis. The thought of Hollywood and show business in California was distant and kind of exciting and romantic, but very uh, like completely alien to me
Sure.
personally. I know when I was, I guess, about 6, my mom took me to see Captain Kangaroo making a personal appearance at a huge auditorium. And that was just electrifying to see. There he is, the guy that I see on our TV set, and he's in color and in 3 dimensions.
Yeah.
And also, right around that time, the Three Stooges made a personal appearance when they were promoting one of their mediocre feature films that they made towards the end. And I had been watching the shorts on TV that have just been in constant syndication. And I couldn't understand why they looked so much older in person because I didn't understand the concept that I was watching short films from the 30s and 40s, and
Yeah.
here it was the 60s. And I thought Curly looked different because it was Joe DeRita, Curly Joe, that they had switched out for Curly, who had died. But it was still so exciting to see them. I also remember um, Larry had his hair slicked back instead of frizzed out, and I remember Mo said, "This is Larry. He combs his hair with an egg beater." And I remember thinking, even at 6 or 7, thinking, Mo, that joke doesn't work because his hair isn't frizzed out
Yeah.
like an egg beater. It's slick, this 8 strands slicked back. But that was so exciting to see, because I was just, this kid from the Midwest where the movies and stars and all that were, godlike creatures that lived in another kingdom.
Sure.
And then, as I mentioned in the book, on our flight to LA from St. Louis in 62, sitting directly in front of us was Red Skelton. And sitting a few seats in front of him was Andy Griffith. And they were both at the height of their television popularity. I mean, the Red Skelton Hour topped the ratings, and the Andy Griffith Show was in its early years. And I thought, wow, it's really like I Love Lucy, where Lucy just goes into a restaurant and there's William Holden or John Wayne or something. We haven't even landed in California and I'm already seeing celebrities. So it was always, like I said, my mom was always saying, "Isn't that someone?" And she would come back from shopping and say, "I met Simon Oakland at Gelson's Market." And it's like, "Oh wow, he was in West Side Story and Psycho." And yeah, there was always something special about. and unfortunately, my mom died before my Groucho experience, which is really too bad because as someone who loved movies and going to movies and spotting celebrities and all that, that the wonderland that opened up to me stepping into Groucho's house would have been, she wouldn't have believed it. My dad was able to appreciate it, and I actually arranged to have him come to lunch there one day as a Father's Day present, which he later said was probably one of the great thrills of his life, standing next to Lou Gehrig and touching the spirit of St. Louis.
Wow.
So that was gratifying.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was always, there was always something special about celebrities.
I twofold I want to say about that. One, I can sort of relate to you in the sense of, you know, where I'm from in Rhode Island, it's not a hotbed like a New York City or Los Angeles where you're able to see all these well-known stars walk through town. So when you have the opportunity, you're sort of gawking at them and saying, "Oh my gosh, there's this person." I remember when I went to New York City one day years ago, and Lester Holt walked by me, and it was like, oh my gosh, there he is, as almost like a ghost was there. Your mouth drops to
It's
the floor.
strange to see someone in person that you're used to seeing on your television set.
Yeah.
And there's initially you feel like, oh, I know this. Oh no, I don't. It's just that I see him. I remember when I was years later when I was a production secretary at Universal Studios, the glass doors of one of the production buildings opened up, and this late middle-aged woman walked out, and I immediately thought that she must be one of the older secretaries because she looked familiar. And I just went, "Hi!" And Angela Lansbury said, "Hello," and walked. And it was that thing of, no, I don't know you. I just know you from there.
Yeah.
So you and Lester Holt, you didn't really know him, but you knew him well.
Yeah. I want to, mentioning that flight you took where Red Skelton and Andy Griffith were on there, and you got two different interactions with both of those guys. One, sort of scoffed at the sense of giving you a signature, and the other one sort of playing around with you and your family. Do you think that moment, although that was earlier in your years, helped you understand and accept the different interactions you'd have in Hollywood or in the entertainment world when you were older working in it?
I've never thought about that. I think I was too shy when I got a little older. I think I was too shy to go talk to famous people. I guess when I was, 7 on the airplane and he's sitting right in front of me, and Skelton is, he had one of those little pop guns where you made out of wood where you push the back and a cork on a string comes out. And he had that tucked into his sport jacket pocket. And he would turn around every now and again and just pop to keep me amused. Now, of course, it would have been confiscated and he would have been wrestled to the ground by security. But you could smuggle a pop gun on a plane in '62. So he made it easy. But I was so intimidated at the thought of meeting famous people. Clearly, I have gotten better at it. And I always try to, first you have to gauge, are they about to put a fork full of food in their mouth? Probably not the best time to go say something. But I always try to say something that's a little to the left or right of what they're used to hearing. Years ago, a friend of mine, I was at a screening, I don't remember what it was a screening of, but the friend I was with said, "Oh, there's Ray Bradbury. I'm friends with his daughter. Come on, I'll introduce you." So he brought me down and he said, "Ray, this is Steve Stoliar. Steve, this is Ray Bradbury." And I shook his hand and I went, "Oh my God, Ray Bradbury. Weren't you a contestant on You Bet Your Life?" And he threw his head back and laughed because he was a contestant on You Bet Your Life in the '50s. But it must have been so refreshing not to have someone say, "Oh, the Martian Chronicles changed my life. I know it backwards and forwards. And with Fahrenheit 451, were you symbolizing?" You get tired of that. So I try to pick something maybe that they're not used to hearing about as often. I've had pretty good luck connecting.
after you're growing up, and I remember also in the book you talk and you bring about oftentimes sort of in a reflection aspect later on your experiences with Groucho, that moment where you saw him in the back of the theater as he's sort of at an older state and sort of shuffling off the stage, backstage. For you growing up, I mean, even at that time when you experienced him, then he was of an older time in his life. He wasn't center stage. I feel as though maybe even in the sense of like how Marlon Brando was later in life as he wasn't as active. For you, being at that point for him, what attracted you about that at a young age? Seeing as there are other comedians who are younger and more um, in front of the camera instead of Groucho.
Right. Well, uh, I guess because I was so into old movies and the classic comedians, people who were from that period had a special glow. When I mentioned working as a production secretary at Universal, when I was there, I never cared about the current stars. They just didn't register with me.
Sure.
So if I saw Lindsay Wagner from Bionic Woman, or Lee Majors from $6 Million Man, or James Garner from Rockford Files, it was cool to see them, but it didn't resonate. But when they had a guest star, when Lauren Bacall was a guest star on the Rockford Files, I sought her out. When Fred Astaire was a guest star on, of all the unlikely things, Battlestar Galactica, because his grandson liked the show, then it resonated. And it didn't matter to me if they were old or half forgotten. Tom Ewell was a semi-regular on Beretta. He was the star of the 7-Year Itch opposite Marilyn Monroe. So I brought a photo from 7-Year Itch, and I was friends with the secretary on the show, and she had Ewell sign it. And she said, he was so flattered that you wanted his autograph. And I thought, God, he was such a big star in the mid. He was also in uh, The Girl Can't Help It with Jane Mansfield. Uh, he was a big star in the 50s, but then by Beretta, he was lucky to get the gig. But I always saw them for what they were at their peak. So the fact that Groucho was older and slower and frail, that didn't make me any less interested in him. And it didn't make me want to seek out the current crop of comedians more, simply because they were in their prime.
Sure. Well, that's sort of like for me, and obviously nothing compared to maybe Groucho's level, but I'm a big fan of the Beach Boys, and they've been around since the early '60s, and now both there are three of their living founders are all in their early '80s, and of course, as the years go on, as you probably saw with Groucho, the voice thins out a little bit, and it's not as powerful as it once was, but to still see that person with that size stature in concert holds more value than someone else from my current generation, because I couldn't tell you of an interest I had in seeing Taylor Swift or some of that generation, but to see someone from years ago that now maybe not, I don't want to say necessarily overlooked, but not as a heavyweight as they once were, is still beneficial. What does that say then about you then necessarily? I mean, appreciating the star regardless of the quality it was at that point, compared to maybe other friends of yours that overlooked it and kind of chuckled at the fact that here's this older version of him, this older man that's still out there, even if he doesn't have to.
In America, unfortunately, a celebrity is as good as his most recent film. In Europe, an artist is as good as the best thing he ever did. So Billy Wilder, people would say, "Oh God, did you see Buddy Buddy? It was so pathetic compared to his earlier film." But Billy Wilder would go to Europe, and it was like, "Oh my God, there's the guy who gave us Sunset Boulevard and Some Like It Hot and Double Indemnity." They didn't care. And I guess that's always been my personality, is to appreciate them. It's like I got to meet Brian Wilson once briefly And of course, all the years of drug abuse
Yeah,
and emotional turmoil, and he's sort of like shell shocked. Um, and I knew I wouldn't have much time with him, and I just said, "Thank you for more than I can possibly articulate." And I said, and I'm a friend of Tony Asher's, who wrote the
yeah,
lyrics to God Only Knows. And he said, "Oh, Tony's a great guy to work with." And it was like that was more than most people got that were
sure.
with me in line to have him sign a CD.
Yeah,
Just a little connection there. But yeah, that it's like I see Brian Wilson and I don't think, oh, how sad. Think about how he used to be. I think there is that man, that genius of melody
yeah.
that gave us so many pop hits. So
It's sort of
that's just
interesting
how my
to
brain works.
yeah, or it's even like and another scenario, another spectrum of that is I this past I shouldn't say well, yeah, I guess this past summer I went to go see Barry Manilow from the 70s who although he's had some work done, I will say that much. He still his voice is still amazing and he's getting this
Good.
ovation and he was saying Weekend in New England, which of course Rhode Island's in New England, and you see him get a tear down his face because there's still a crowd of people who like these stars and still love them and come in droves to see him, which is definitely something that I'm sure that they appreciate, even if they may not say it. After seeing him live at Groucho that time with your friend at the back of the theater, how soon after were you gearing up or going to want to make sure Animal Crackers was back out of the theater? Were you cautiously planning it out, or were you immediately jumping to it?
Well, I saw Groucho's one man show at the Dorothy Chandler Pavilion towards the end of 72. And because he was old and frail, I thought this is the closest I will ever get to him is from,
Yeah,
this tiny man in a spotlight in this huge auditorium. And it would so frustrate me when I would hear people say, "Oh, I was driving through Beverly Hills the other day. I saw Groucho taking a walk in the park." And it would be so frustrating. And I'd think, should I bring a pup tent to that park? Should I? And it's all these near misses. But I knew for a fact I would never, ever get to meet him. And it was a year later that I saw a bootleg print of Animal Crackers at a small theater in Anaheim. And that ended up putting me in touch with Harry Ruby, who was one of Groucho's oldest friends, one of his writers, and who was listed in the phone book. And I called basically to say, I know the movie hasn't been seen in a while. If Groucho hasn't seen it, it's playing at this theater in Anaheim. And they took down my name and number, and I ended up getting a call from Erin Flemming, who was the young actress who was really um, in charge of his life at that point. She had started out as his secretary, but had become his manager, and he had become really reliant on her judgment. And so she wanted to bring me to Universal as like exhibit A of this young person that was willing to drive all the way to Anaheim to see Animal Crackers, because Universal owned the film. They had bought all the old Paramount films in the late 50s, but they couldn't re-release Animal Crackers because basically through a clerical error, the copyright had expired when it was at Paramount, and the rights reverted back to the writers and composers of the original Animal Crackers Broadway show. And Universal thought, we're not going to spend good money bringing out an old black and white
yeah,
Marx Brothers. And all my friends, of course, were thinking, this is the Holy Grail. This is the lost. This is the missing link. This is. And she wanted to say, this is Steve Stoliar. He went all the way to Anaheim to see this movie, and he has. But in the meantime, I came up with the idea of a petition drive when I was at UCLA, which is where I was attending school, to show that it wasn't just me and maybe a few friends of mine, but that many hundreds, if not thousands, of people would like to see Animal
yeah,
Crackers out again. And Erin arranged for Groucho to come to UCLA. And, my heart was pounding out of my chest. I said, Groucho, I'm very happy to be meeting you after all this time. And he said, well, you should be. And Erin said, this is Steve Stoliar. He's the one trying to get Animal Crackers re-released. And Groucho said, well, did you get it? And I said, not yet, but we're working on it. And he said, you better or I'll fire you. And I said, I didn't realize I was working for you. How much are you paying me? And he said, a little less than nothing. And we were off and running, talking to the press and this crush of students hanging on his every word. And it got a lot of publicity. And Universal relented and decided we will clear the rights and we will show it in Westwood at a theater there and at a theater in New York. And then that's it. And we don't want to hear any more about this. And it ended up breaking the house record, box office record in Westwood that had been set by the French Connection several years earlier. And then Groucho went to New York for the premiere there, and he was almost killed by the crush of people waiting to see it. So, and then I was rewarded with this plum job of getting to work inside my hero's house, make my own hours, and get paid money to immerse myself in all of Groucho's memorabilia, letters, scripts with notes, photos of the brothers from childhood out of makeup, posters, all these extraordinary things that were just sort of jammed into closets without any thought to organizing them. And also because the Marx Brothers had enjoyed this renaissance, they were embraced by the baby boomers because of all their anti-establishment. They fit in real well with the hippie vibe of sticking it to the establishment. And so he was getting a lot of fan mail, and Erin Flemming couldn't keep up with it. So they needed an actual secretary instead of her, you know, she had become his manager. And I ended up working there the last 3 years of his life. And it was just mind blowing to be able to spend that kind of quality time asking him questions I'd had for years. Meeting the other two living brothers, Zeppo and Gummo, who were the straight men in the act, but were still bona fide Marx Brothers. They had great senses of humor. And it made me think, what must it have been like when Chico and Harpo were still alive and they were all at the height of their power, because they were still vastly entertaining in their old age with just the three who were there. But I got, you know, the people, there were people from in front of and behind the cameras. So because I was such a Marx fanatic, I knew who all of these writers were because oh, that's Nat Perrin. He worked on Monkey Business and Duck Soup. There's Irv Brecker. He wrote At the Circus. And then, of course, there were, you know, Mae West and Bob Hope and Jack Lemmon and Steve Allen and all of these celebrities. And then a whole younger generation. I mean, at the time, they were the younger generation of stars coming to meet him or get to know him. Bud Cort and Elliot Gould and Sally Kellerman and the Smothers Brothers, people who had themselves grown up worshiping Groucho and the Marx Brothers. It was, you know, a remarkable experience for me, but also the downside was I was getting close to my hero as he's fading out. So I was, instead of just being someone seeing something on the news or reading something in the paper, I was witnessing his health problems and how some days he was sharper than others. And then there was Erin Flemming's mercurial personality. She could just fly into a rage and scream and throw things, and it would, Groucho's blood pressure would shoot way up, and it was quite a balancing act for this 20-year-old kid. You know, I didn't grow up in any kind of volatile household. There was no screaming. There was no, you know, like drinking or people in a drunken rage or something. It was very middle of the road, and all of a sudden, it's like, here is my hero, but he's frail and fading out. And here is this woman that hired me, but she's unbalanced and
Yeah.
unpredictable. But I managed to be there the the whole time when other employees, she ruled that place. But it was, if she suspected any kind of disloyalty, it was off with their heads.
Yeah.
So I somehow managed to strike that balance.
I'm curious about this, and I feel as though, although for my generation growing up with social media, that you could, of course, go viral at any minute, any day, it's harder than maybe how it was for you when you're able to just to call these people on the phone in the phone book to connect with them. I remember Gino Vanelli sharing this point that he made many years ago, where he just walks on this recording this set to record an album, and he's just there, and then he doesn't really get in trouble. Whereas you're able to call these people, somehow Erin finds out about you, then you're able to meet this guy and get so close with them so quickly. Would you agree with that, that it was easier when you were younger to do this stuff compared to maybe generation nowadays?
Uh, yeah, one of the main differences is security. None of those homes had gates. You could just drive uphill crest, and when you got to 1083, pull into the circular driveway or into the garage and walk up the steps and knock on the door. Doesn't mean you would be warmly welcomed or that anyone would answer. But now the house has, you have to be buzzed in, and there's surveillance cameras,
Yeah.
and you can't just, and everyone has their entourage, their cadre of bodyguards and people that, their job is to insulate the celebrities against the public. They were much more accessible back then. Plus, the kind of people that I was writing fan letters to or spotting in restaurants or something were people that had been, really famous in the 30s or 40s, and weren't getting that much attention, so it wasn't that big a deal. Whereas if I had tried to write a fan letter to like Paul McCartney or Warren Beatty or something like that, it probably would have, been intercepted by a fan mail service
Yeah.
or something like that. But and also Groucho, uh, he signed photos for people. I would leave a stack of 8x10s and a black Sharpie on his desk, and he would sign Groucho on all of them. As requests came in from fans, I would personalize them
Yeah.
with a black Sharpie, trying to emulate his handwriting. And I see a lot of those cycling through on eBay with certificates of authenticity that it's all Groucho's handwriting. It's like, I didn't know I was such a good forger when I was 20. But all of the Groucho signatures were his. And, as I was leaving his office one day with a stack of them, I turned around and I said, on behalf of all the people who will never get a chance to tell you this personally, thank you for taking the time to sign your name on all of these. And he said, well, it's a part of my job. And I thought, lesser stars wouldn't have fooled with it. They would have either had it diverted to a mail service, or had a rubber stamp that a secretary could use, or pre-printed something. He made a point of signing his name, and if people stopped him, he would laboriously scrawl, to Bill from Groucho on a scrap of paper. So yeah, they were more accessible then. But once you have something like John Lennon's murder, and people at peril from stalkers. I was an obsessive Groucho fan. I don't mind admitting that, but I just wanted to meet him. I didn't want to marry him or murder
Yeah.
him. But there's a lot of nut bars, and
Oh,
I
sure.
can
Yeah.
understand why they need to feel safe going out, and certainly at home. Also, you didn't have anything like, global positioning
Yeah.
satellites, or Googling an address and seeing what the front gate looks like, and
Yeah.
seeing it was all, it was much more old-fashioned and hands-on back then.
I'm
So
guessing you weren't the type of person who nowadays, or I think Michael Jackson's a good example where you see people getting plastic surgery to look just like him. I'm guessing you weren't the type of person growing up to want to look just like Groucho Marx.
I grew a mustache, and that was the extent
Yeah,
of my emulation.
yeah,
I didn't dress up as him and get a plastic cigar as a kid or something. No, it didn't really. It didn't interest me to try to remake myself in his image.
sure. With I mean, you probably have to have when you're putting out this plan to get this movie re-released and getting these signatures, which you end up getting, of course, tons of them. There has to be, I'm sure, a sense of realism to say, okay, if this doesn't happen, I'm just move on with the rest of my life or whatever. And what if he does? There's a good chance he would even find out about this or know about this. Was there any of that bar set, or were you only preparing for him finding out and being a part of it and helping out with this?
No, I never expected to meet him. I certainly never expected to work for him. It was all unexpected wonderfulness that just came from it. I did not have a master plan. Like I said, he was already old and frail. So trying to plan to meet someone who you're waiting to pick up the paper and read died of a heart attack last night, something like that. And at the time, I was a history major at UCLA. I had a flair for comedy and I loved old movies, but I didn't think there was any kind of future in that. Not that
Sure.
there's a future in history, but I had always loved archaeology and paleontology and and just having that historical perspective, which also came in so handy as I was meeting these people at Groucho's house, thinking, gee, you were there, you knew George Gershwin personally, and
Wow.
you went over to W.C. Fields' house, and that was in the 20s, and uh, so I was, my plan was, I guess, to be a history teacher. I really wasn't sure what I was going to do with it, but I wasn't any good in math, and I wasn't good with my hands. I mean, I
Sure.
really didn't know what I was going to be when I grew up, but I was in college and had to do something.
Yeah.
But 2 years into being a history major, I switched to motion picture television because the atmosphere at Groucho's was so irresistible.
Sure.
It was such a strong magnetic pull in that direction, especially, you know, his old time friends were much more comfortable with their fame and wealth,
Sure.
and they were very easy to talk to and very encouraging. But it was Erin Flemming was friends with more the younger crowd, and they were the ones that seemed to have the attitude. Uh, but I really connected with the old guys and thought I would like to be a part of this world.
Sure.
And so, like S.J. Perelman, who co-wrote Monkey Business and Horse Feathers and won an Oscar for co-writing Around the World in 80 Days. In addition to that, he was one of the premier humorists of the 20th century. Actually, he used to bristle when people would only see him as one of Groucho's old writers, because his short essays for the New Yorker filled, I think, 20 books.
Oh wow.
So he was on his own a very respected humorist and author, not just a gag man. But he did come to Groucho's once, and I got to meet him, and we got into a conversation, and he asked me what I wanted to do, and I said probably write for television. And he said he advised me to write for the theater because the writer has more control over it if you write a play, as opposed to the producers who have control over television and the directors who have control over films. Uh, and there I was just sitting there thinking, wow, S.J. Perelman is giving me
Yeah.
career advice, and I haven't even fully decided that that's what I want to do. And I said, if I were to bring one of your books to where you're staying, would you sign it for me? and he was staying at the Chateau Marmont before it became infamous for being where John Belushi died. And I went to a bookstore and got his latest book, Vinegar Puss, and I left it there. And then someone at the desk phoned me to say it was ready, and I drove over there and opened it up. And he had written for Steve Stoliar with very cordial wishes for his ultimate success as a writer. And that, it's like I would look at that and think, well, now I have to be a writer. Otherwise,
Yeah.
people are going to read it and say, you're a plumber. Who was this guy that wished you well as a writer?
Yeah.
Very encouraging to get something like that when you're
Sure.
20.
Well, I remember I had seen the current version of the Beach Boys this past winter during their holiday tour near where I live to a certain extent, and you go backstage, and I'm a big nut for the group and their history and so forth, and your palms get sweaty, you get nervous, you start sweating, then you go backstage, and it's completely normal, as I'm sure it was for when you're seeing these stars that they're regular people, of course. You have a million questions rattling off to ask them, and then you're talking to one of them who had done some work with Pink Floyd and talking about that, talking about how he's still surfing and so on and so forth. And he's telling you about advice and what to do, get your master's degree in college after getting your regular bachelor's degree. And it's like, this guy, 80 years old, is giving me advice on how to live life. And I'm just trying to have a regular conversation and not seem like a monkey out there and seem like a
Yeah,
fool. So it's definitely something that you appreciate. For you, all of that, you mentioned, of course, and it says in the book where Groucho was in life. How quickly did you learn to accept that balance of being a fan of Groucho, but then working for him, especially at the state he was?
I don't think it took me that long to sort of gauge the latitude and longitude of how to handle myself around him, and it it meant a lot to me that he got me. Um, I mean, like one time he called me into his room and he gave me a $20 bill, and he said, "Run over to Tower Records and get me some records. You know what I like." And I thought, how cool that he knows that I would know what he liked.
Yeah.
And he appreciated the fact that I cared about, uh, James Thurber and Robert Benchley and George Gershwin and Irving Berlin, and that I wasn't just some pot smoking hippie that listened to loud rock and roll, which he did. He was never a fan of rock and roll, but he's to be forgiven that because he was from 1890, for
Sure.
heaven's sake, when Gilbert and Sullivan were still writing operettas. It occurs to me. So that meant a lot, but also, as is the case with old people who are getting hazy, there was also a certain unpredictableness where something could be perfectly fine 4 times, and then on the 5th time they find it objectionable, and
Sure.
so it's hard to gauge. So I would be prepared for him to be in a bad mood or forget something, um, and I would say, people say, "Oh, you were friends," and I'm hesitant to say that because I think it inflates the situation. But I was certainly more than just an employee. I was more than Arturo the gardener or Mabel the maid. Uh, I would say he was fond of me, sort of like an uncle.
Yeah.
I think it's presumptuous for me to say, "Oh yeah, we became friends and we shot the shit and he was really good." I can't do that.
Yeah.
Um, I have finally gotten past my fear of saying that Woody Allen and I are friends because he has introduced me to people as a good friend of his, and uh, I finally accepted
Sure.
that we are in fact friends, and it isn't just that we know each other.
Well, that's probably a hard thing to even fathom, that you're on the same, that this person's willingly to have you on the same level as them because they've had all the success, and it's a gratifying thing as well. With the process you put together to get that movie out there, and of course you're thinking, okay, what if this doesn't work and now I have to find something else? Because I remember in the book your dad sort of gave you the conversation of, okay, go to Taco Bell, they may be offering, or
Get
go
off your
somewhere else.
fanny. I
Yes.
don't want you sitting around all summer. Go get a job.
So with
There's
that, I mean, how desperate were you in hoping that something would come from this process that you're going out to get the movie, and Erin giving you that call?
it. I don't think it occurred to me that it. Once the Animal Crackers campaign ended and they brought the movie out, I went through a little postpartum depression because it
Yeah.
was such a rush to be in touch with those people and to meet Groucho and get his autograph. Uh, and then I thought my purpose, I have served my purpose. I was a loyal fan who was tirelessly working to get this previously lost film out again. And why would they stay in touch with me?
Sure.
And it's like I was trying to think of how can I still touch base with them. And it was, as I mentioned in the book, and as you mentioned, I had a few summer jobs that fell through in the summer of 74, for which I remain eternally grateful. So with my back against the wall, I thought, I have absolutely nothing to lose by asking before I decide go to Taco Bell or go to the tire store and sell tires. So I called Erin and I said, is there anything at all that you think maybe I might sort of kind? And she said, well, actually, as you know, I had been Groucho's secretary, but now I'm so busy. But we need someone to handle all the fan mail that comes in and also to organize all of his memorabilia that's going to go to the Smithsonian after he's gone. And it needs to be someone who really knows their Marx Brothers. And I'm thinking, please, 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 please. And sure enough, she said, why don't we try you out? And initially, I figured I would be working at an office building and maybe he'd come in once a month to sign checks or something. And she said, oh, no, dear, there's a room there that you can use for your office at Groucho's. You can make your own hours, uh, come and go. I mean, the enormous trust
Sure.
based on the Crackers connection. And the first week, it was during summer vacation. The first week I worked Monday through Saturday and then figured I'd take Sunday off. And then I was in the family house on Sunday thinking, why do I want a day off from, it was like, no, I don't want any chocolate chip cookies today. I had them other days. It's like, yes, I want them. And so I worked 7 days a week at first because it was just such an immersive experience. And so stimulating to be, I was never relegated to the kitchen for lunch. It wasn't like the help eats in there and I was always welcome at the lunch table. So no matter who came over, I was a part of that, if only as a listener. And if no one interesting came over, there was still Groucho and either a nurse or Erin or just the two of us. And we were, and he was able to tell me about the people he knew and worked with and what life was like in vaudeville. Or if we were lucky, George Burns would come over or Jack Lemmon would come over and I'd get to watch it. I was nervous about meeting George Burns. It was before the Sunshine Boys. But again, as with your earlier question, I saw through this little old man and could see half of Burns and Allen from those 30s movies, Paramount movies, and the TV show and his radio show. So even though he hadn't hit his renaissance yet with Sunshine Boys and Oh God and all those movies. And so the doorbell rang and I opened it up and this little man looked up and smiled and said, hi, you want to live a long time? Become an actor. You'll live to be an old man like Groucho and me. Okay, let's eat. And into the dining room we shuffled. And it was just remarkable listening to him and Groucho talk about people that they knew, the owners of vaudeville houses, and when George and Gracie would double date with Harpo and Susan to go see movies, and just sometimes in life you meet people when you're young and you don't appreciate them till you're older, and you think, oh, I could kick myself for not knowing who that was. I would have asked him that. In this case, I got this job at the zenith of my obsession with the Marx Brothers. So I was able to really fully drink in the company I was with and never took any of it for granted. Even after I'd been there for a couple of years, there was never a sense of, well, I guess I'll go over to Groucho.
Yeah.
And it's like if I was in the kitchen and the tour bus would stop by in front of the driveway, I would wave at the window, figuring some guy from Milwaukee will think, could have been Groucho. I don't know. Someone waved from the kitchen, because I always kept I always had mentally one foot on the outside looking in, because I never stopped being a fan, even as I was on the inside. And the famous people who came over didn't know who I was, but they figured if he's here on the inside, he must be okay. I don't know if he's Groucho's grandson or who this kid is. But, the only person that was snooty towards me was Barbara Streisand. She really stands out as someone. It was as if I didn't exist. She didn't acknowledge when I spoke. She looked past me to say something to someone else. She was completely dismissive, but she was the exception to the rule, because, as I say, there were a lot of people from the olden days and the then current days, from in front of and the other side of the camera, and I was able to interact with them very comfortably, but not La Streisand.
How far along into your journey with Groucho did you come to the thought process of, I want to get close to this man? Was it early on, or was it more further along the way before you started to feel comfortable to be comfortable with him?
I was still nervous, in the initial days and I guess weeks. It was still so kind of scary, exciting when he would shuffle past my room while I was working on the fan mail, and he'd stop and talk to me about something. And I gradually got more comfortable, but again, I didn't have any master plan. I was really in the moment, always expecting it to end either because Erin fired me for real or imagined reasons, or Groucho's death. In the book, I talk about how I opened the book with the story about when I'd been working there for a few weeks and had finally gotten used to it. And it's like, this is so cool and I'm so lucky. And I rang the bell and the maid answered, and she said, please be quiet, Mr. Marx has had a stroke. And I thought, that's it. The coach is turning into a pumpkin. The horse is back into mice. It was a great run while it lasted for a month or two. And the maid said, the nurse is asking for you. So I went back down the hallway to his bedroom, expecting him to be lying paralyzed and unable to speak. And instead he was lying in bed, propped up in his pajamas with his mucklucks on, his shoes, and reading the paper. Basically, he said, is the ambulance here yet? No, that figures. And you go back to, and I was so relieved, because in my mind, the word stroke meant that that's it. They're gone. And, I learned a lot about old age and physiology and the mind working there. And it was a very minor stroke, but still the nurse needed my help in getting him to the bathroom, because he was, it was like he was sloped over to one side a little bit, which he eventually got past. But I was always expecting that the end could come at any point because of Erin's mercurial nature
Yeah.
and Groucho's mortality.
I want to ask you about this as well. Obviously, you're a fan of Groucho, and that's probably your favorite out of the ones. So then again, who knows? But in of course, the books written about him and all the other brothers who were in the that were in the productions, not just on stage, but in movies as well and television. But you not only knew the family members, the kids, Groucho's son, Andy, and then I'm sure others as well, Groucho's other daughter, but you're able to meet the two living brothers, as you mentioned, of Groucho's, and then one of them ends up, taking your ex-girlfriend out on a
Yes,
date.
Zeppo.
Yes, for you to go from being a fan of this family, this historic, legendary family, into growing, imagining, oh, it'd be cool to meet these people, to then meeting one of them, and then to them have him ask for your former girlfriend's number. Was that sort of a sort of unbelievable, unimaginable event for you?
Yes, and it wasn't lost on me at the time because when I went to see Groucho's one man show in 72 before meeting him, after the show, my roommate Daryl and I were in the parking garage and I spotted Zeppo, who I recognized because, again, I had absorbed everything on the Marx Brothers and I knew what he looked like at that point. And I thought, well, I'm never going to get to meet Groucho, but I'm going to meet a Marx brother.
Yeah.
And I walked over and I just said, "Excuse me, Mr. Marx, I just wanted to let you know how much I enjoy your films." And he said, "You weren't enjoying me, you were enjoying my brothers." And I thought, gee, I'm so glad I made a point of coming over
Yeah.
here to compliment this guy. Yes, he was fairly abrupt. I think he was having trouble finding his car. And to realize that 2 years later, he's charming and funny, and he's in, you know, you ought to come visit me in Palm Springs, Steve. And, well, I don't know, when I was there when I was a kid and it was sweltering. Well, when were you there? In the summer? Yeah. Well, Steve, it's cold in Alaska during the winter too. And then the young lady I was dating and I broke up, and he had sort of taken a liking to her when I brought her there for dinner once. And so I had gotten a couple pictures of him and Groucho, and I wanted him to sign them. And in my cover letter to him, I said, "Well, Linda and I have broken up, and I know you've been around the block a few times. Do you have any advice for the lovelorn?" And I get a call. "Steve, it's Zeppo Marx. Is this a bad time?" "No. Listen, I got the pictures. God, I was good looking back then. And listen, I don't want to step on your toes, but do you think Linda would go out with me?" And I thought, what? I I said, and he said, "Because if this is at all uncomfortable for you, the last thing I would want to do is no, 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 no. It's where she got a kick out of you. And I just said, let me see if she's interested. Okay, because if there's any problem with it, no, 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 no." So I checked with Linda, and she too thought it was just kind of like, what a strange thing, but why would I not want to at least experience
Yeah.
this strange? So he took her to dinner in San Diego and then down to Tijuana to watch a highlight game. I guess that was his standard first date, was dinner in San Diego and a highlight game. And I saw him afterwards. He said, "I want you to know, Steve, I didn't even kiss her. She's very nice, but all she did was talk about herself." And then I saw her on campus and she said, "Zeppo was very nice, but all he did was talk about himself." And I thought, well, this has a certain symmetry to it.
Yeah.
And then thereafter, when Zeppo would be at a party at Groucho's, he'd make a point of introducing you to someone, and he'd say, "This is Steve. He's a nice kid. He and I dated the same girl, but he got further with it than I did." So yeah, she was 19, I was 20, and he was 74.
Oh, there you go.
So, but I can, all these years later, I can say Zeppo Marx and I dated the same girl, to
Yeah.
which people will say, "Who is Zeppo Marx?"
Yeah. Um, You mentioned that the mercurial aspect and behavior of his once secretary turned manager, Erin Flemming, who near the end, as it says in the book, got a little too much to deal with, and almost there was a campaign to almost remove her from sort of the environment, which then ended up backfiring, and everyone was then released in a matter of short time. For you joining this group, I mean, at first, you also mentioned in the book how you sort of took sides with her. You had respect for her, you thought highly of her, and then you seeing these different sides to this person, you really had no clue who she really was. Handling that as a different perspective from that group. Obviously, there's Groucho and there's his family members, but then there's Aaron, and then there's you, and a third perspective dealing with that for someone who sort of tricked you into what she truly was. How do you remember handling that as a young child, as a young person?
Well, I never stopped being grateful. I mean, if it hadn't been, Erin was the one that, hired and fired
Yeah.
people for the household. So I will always owe her that. And in the beginning, when we were doing the Animal Crackers campaign, I felt so flattered when she would call me at like 2:30 in the morning just to gab. And I would think, wow, of all the people in the world, she wants to talk to me. How lucky I am, because I knew who she was from having read all the new interviews with Groucho and seeing him on TV and all. And it was sort of a gradual awakening, realizing the darker aspects of it. And ultimately, the negative outweighed the positive. I spend a goodly amount of time answering people's questions about Erin because they want to know thumbs up or thumbs down.
Yeah.
Was she a good person or a bad person? Was she good for him? And it's, the quote that I keep using in the book was said by Andre Gide, which is the color of truth is gray. People are very rarely all heroic or all villainous. The heroes have flaws, and nefarious people have
Yeah.
their good side. So, and also Erin had mental illness, which
Sure.
I'm sympathetic to, but putting someone that volatile in charge of a fragile older guy is just such a dangerous
Sure.
equation. So, and of course, once she saw that my allegiance had shifted from her, uh, uh, she she was furious.
Sure.
And I remember she was on the phone to someone saying, "Fucking servants are treating me like a cockroach."
Oh wow.
Uh, because I was actually in charge of the household on weekends back when during the big court fight over his conservatorship, because some of the nurses had started reporting that Erin was abusive to Groucho and over medicated him and would scream and all these things. So she was she was not allowed to be in charge of his life, and temporarily the judge appointed Nat Perrin, one of Groucho's, as I say, old writer friends. And on the weekends, Nat asked me to stay at the house to basically supervise the two warring factions. There's Erin and her friends, and then Groucho's son Arthur and his friends, and Groucho's old time friends. And I would have to kind of orchestrate where they wouldn't run into each other because there was such suspicion. I mean, Erin was paranoid, and then, but in the case of our attempted coup, even though she was paranoid, she was right. We were out
Yeah.
to get her at that point. But she was convinced there was surveillance devices that Groucho's son had installed in all the rooms and all the. I mean, it was kind of crazy,
Sure.
and I just did my best to try to keep things as stable as I could. But
Sure.
for Erin, it was just she was furious at the idea that this kid that she hired is saying, Erin, I think it's time for you tonight. I think you'll come back tomorrow. You, how dare you tell me?
Yeah.
And she would call Nat Parent and say, "You can't let servants treat me this way." It was crazy, but
Oh,
I
I'm
wouldn't have
sure.
traded any of it.
Sure. On another more lighter note and a more positive note, you also there's another moment in the book that I really took a liking towards, which is where even as Groucho was older, he still there are moments of where he took liking to you and cared about you. And a moment was when you went to go visit a relative, I believe it was your sister or
Yeah.
somebody in Portland, and he asked where you were, and the staff member said, "Oh, he's out visiting his relative in Portland." To experience that side of Groucho, which might not have been as present maybe to others or in general, how was that for you, even looking back at it at this point in your life?
Well, it meant a lot to me because it's one thing if you get a compliment from someone and you're not sure if they're just saying that. But if they say something nice about you to someone else, it isn't with the intention of it getting back to you. So it must have been a legitimate thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, his cook Martha told when I came back from visiting my sister in Portland, she said, "Mr. Marx came down the hallway and he got to your room and he looked in and you weren't there. And he came and he said, 'Martha, where's Steve?' And I told him you were visiting out of town. And he said, 'He's a nice boy and he knows what he's doing.'" And I thought, I can die now.
Yeah.
And in one of the photos I had Groucho sign was a beautiful portrait of him from 1930 from publicity shot from Animal Crackers. And he wrote, "To Steve, a valuable man." And then he accidentally crossed the first L on valuable. And he looked at it and he said, "Well, it looks like it says to Steve, the vegetable man, but you know what it means." Again, it meant the world to me that he described me. He also, as you may know from reading the book, but that doesn't mean your listeners and viewers know this, he called me a genius.
Wow.
It was because I was the only person in the household who could figure out how to change the needle on his stereo. Nevertheless, ladies and gentlemen of
Yeah.
the jury, I dare you to make the same claim that Groucho Marx ever said you were a genius. So,
Yeah. I want to end on this quick segment called the One Word Challenge. And in this
oh,
segment, I'll throw out a few names of people, places, or things that have some connection to my guest this week being Steve Stoliar, and he has to do his best to say a word or two that best comes to mind when he hears it. So, Steve, if you're ready, I'll start it.
all right.
Uh,
Doctor,
University City, Missouri.
that was where I was born and spent from 0 to 8. My phone number was Parkview 73529, and the postal code was 30 because it was before zip code.
Los Angeles.
It has been my home for the most part since '62, except for the 2.5 years I spent in New York in the '80s.
Hard work.
Try to avoid it.
Success.
Contentment rather than financial.
Comedy.
Vital to my being.
Groucho Marx.
The best.
And certainly last but never least in this cosmic universe we all call Earth that we currently live on, Steve Stoliar.
Me.
Well, good sir, I want to say thank you for taking the time to do this. It's been a fun time and I enjoy, and I think to myself, I don't know how I connected so much to a movie like A Night in Casablanca, which was so many years ago, and be so connected to it, and then obviously find out about the book, read it, and talk to you. It's been a true treat to me.
Oh, I should probably say my shameless plug.
Yeah,
Raised
go for it.
Eyebrows is available on Amazon in Kindle and audiobook with me doing the voices. And if someone would like to get a signed or personalized copy, they can order it from me at Steve Stoliar, STOLIAR.com, and I'll fix you up.
Well, in the words of Johnny Carson, the Dean of talk shows, certainly like this one today, I bid you all a heartfelt good night.